The original PlayStation had a lot of influential games across many styles and genres. Debatably though, it was most influential and known for its many RPGs, your Final Fantasies and Xenogears, and its survival horror games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. But also on the PlayStation exists a curious fusion of the two genres, creating a bona fide survival horror RPG. Koudelka was released in 1999. It was developed by Studio Saknoth. If you've never heard of them, that's because they basically only developed this and its follow-ups. So there was this composer named Hiroki Kikuta, and he worked at Square and made the music for Romancing Saga, as well as Secret and Trials of Mana. A pretty solid resume at that point. But he wanted to go beyond just being a composer, and apparently he wanted to revolutionize the RPG genre, break away from conventions. Long story short, he would start up Saknoth with some other Square employees, and become this game's director, producer, writer, and of course composer. The only thing he seemed not to do directly was the art and the gameplay, and apparently he wanted to make an RPG with real-time free movement and environmental interactions. I'm imagining Parasite Eve. Instead, the game's designers stuck with something more traditional, and gave us a turn-based tactics style game. Reading up on this game's development, this was a clear passion project for the guy. He read a ton of British history, and apparently planned for this to expand into a series following the main character and their descendants. In the end, what we got is a pretty good RPG, with some survival horror elements mixed in, a good story, great presentation for the PlayStation, and while maybe not the genre-defining game Kikuta wanted, a real cult classic. So let's take a look at Koudelka, the horror RPG. Set in 1898 in Aberystwyth, Wales on Halloween night, Koudelka follows the story of the titular Koudelka as she journeys to and breaks into the Nemetin Monastery, which has been converted to a mansion under certain circumstances. As she enters by scaling the wall, losing her pendant in the process, she happens upon the dying Edward, a self-proclaimed adventurer. She also happens upon Edward's attacker, a monstrous gargoyle, defeating it with Edward's help, which she then repays by magically healing him. It's worth noting that these supernatural elements aren't exactly normal in this world. After this, they encounter the old and slightly shady caretakers of the mansion, and eventually run into James, a Catholic bishop who's exploring Nemetin for his own reasons. The three will form an alliance and explore the dangerous place they find themselves in, as they discover the old dark history of the monastery and the new dark history of the mansion, all while trying not to kill each other themselves as their differing personalities and values collide. James is a very "you filthy heathen" type of bishop. The writing in Koudelka is actually pretty good. In a shake-up from traditional RPGs, Koudelka gives us a smaller, more intimate story instead of characters, instead of the saving the world plot more typical of the genre. The main cast is very limited, and that gives each of them more time to shine and define themselves. Koudelka is a snarky and in-charge protagonist, Edward is more of a charming rogue, both friendly and cold, James is more prideful and sure he's always right. The actual game itself is pretty similar to what you would expect from an RPG. You explore in Nemetin, get into random battles, fight with turn-based combat against the horrifying monsters that lurk, get experience and loot, level up. On paper it's pretty standard, but it's in the finer details that Koudelka stands out, one of the biggest being its presentation. In terms of its in-game graphics, Koudelka looks good for a PS1 game. It goes for the 3D models and pre-rendered backgrounds approach standard for the time, the models are well detailed, the environments are dark and menacing, and the enemy designs have that wonderful early 3D graphics effect, where you can make out what they are, but they're still a bit uncanny. But what may surprise you is when you get into a cutscene. This may not be that apparent if you aren't familiar with the standards of the time, but these are pretty high quality. There's no camera work here, as Koudelka goes to fixed camera angles like its horror game inspirations, but the way the character models naturally move, and especially the voice acting, is way better than what you'd usually get.
Almighty God, please give me the strength to ward off these monsters.
I can see that we've wasted our time here. Let's go, Koudelka.
Just a minute. Although I'm under the protection of the Lord, it doesn't hurt to take precautionary measures.
Also, this game was originally voiced in English for authenticity to the setting. The Japanese had to deal with subtitles. I'll also say the CGI cutscenes would have been pretty nice for the time. Let me put it this way, this game had high enough production values, it had to be put on 4 discs. 4. That's Final Fantasy 8 and 9's amount of discs, and Koudelka's only about 10 to 12 hours long. Then there's the music. So, like a horror game, Koudelka likes to be atmospheric. It's generally quiet to let the ambient noise of your footsteps fill in the silence, but then we get into combat, and this turns into a game made by a composer. So what do you think this game's combat music sounds like? Maybe something slow, subtle, and haunting to make you feel scared and fit the horror theme? No. It sounds like this. Koudelka's battle themes are one of the most memorable things about it, for how good they are, and how random they are. They're way more in your face and energetic than what you'd think. Regardless of how fitting they may or may not be, they certainly work great to accent the battles. And it's about time I get to those. So, as mentioned, Koudelka actually plays pretty typically for its genre inspirations. Outside of battles, you'll walk around the monastery, pick up key items you find by exploring, and use them to solve puzzles. Don't worry though, these aren't the cryptic kind of survival horror puzzles. They're very simple. And as you do this, you'll eventually find yourself getting into combat, where you're presented with a kind of tactics grid. Even your enemies will take turns moving yourselves and performing actions, but with one or two twists. You can't move past the row an enemy's in, and the same goes with them in regards to you. So if you were to fight an enemy that can only attack what's right in front of it, and you had Edward move more forward than Koudelka or James, they'd be safe until the enemy kills Edward. The reason you would want to have front and backline party members is that there's essentially three methods of combat. You have your melee weapons that attack what's in front of you, magic, which can flexibly target around the grid, and guns, which can only fire straight and require limited ammo for each shot. I'll also mention that Koudelka doesn't have any specific character roles. Any character can be built however you want and work effectively. They can all use every magic and every weapon. I chose to make Koudelka a mage, Edward my main fighter, and James has a mix between the two to adapt to the situation. That seemed to work well enough for me, but if you want fighter Koudelka and mage Edward, perfectly viable. On the topic of character builds, a brief note on stats. They work as you would assume: strength is damage, dex is melee accuracy, agility is turn order. Then we have intelligence, which is the effectiveness of your magic, mind, which is magical accuracy, and piety, which is your MP gauge and resistance to spells, including healing magic. Yeah, Koudelka went with the thought process that magic resistance should include healing magic, and if you overlevel a character's piety but not their intelligence, their healing magic won't work on themselves. I actually think it's a cool concept to make both healing magic and healing items important. The other thing I really need to talk about is weapon types and proficiencies. As a survival horror game, you'll find weapons by exploring or just beating enemies. These weapons have random stats and modifiers as well as durability. But don't get nervous, I swear you'll find yourself swimming in weapons. It's worth collecting a bunch of a certain type though, as your characters will gain proficiency with them the more they use them. So if Edward uses swords enough, he'll become level 2 in that weapon type, improving his damage, accuracy, and sometimes allowing him to strike twice. Magic works in a similar way, making it stronger and allowing you to hit multiple targets. Is this a lot of systems for a 10 to 12 hour game? Are you worried about resource management? Well, worry not, as Koudelka is actually pretty easy. According to interviews, they made this game easy enough so people who didn't normally play games could still beat it. What this means is that this game essentially requires no grinding for a smooth experience. If you do a little grinding, the game will be a pretty leisurely time when it comes to combat difficulty. Maybe a boss or two will provide a little trouble, but it'd be pretty lame if they didn't. Grinding may also be the only way to get armor in this game. In a weird twist, I don't think you can get any armor from exploring, and it's all a rare drop from enemies. Don't know why they did it that way. You can also get special gear by saving your game with a specific playtime and a certain amount of items, including a sword that exists solely to kill the hidden sewer boss. The game has other minor points of criticism. You have a lot of inventory space for what you need, but key items do take up space. I feel like this made sense in survival horror games with a bigger focus on inventory management, but not so much here. The tactics style combat system also doesn't get very tactical. There's one or two boss fights to make good use of the system, but other than that, it feels like wasted potential. But the most infamous, weird, and kind of bad thing about this game has to do with its endings. Now of course I'm not going to spoil them, but I suggest you listen or else risk being very confused. Remember when Koudelka lost her pendant in the game's intro? You can eventually get to the courtyard at the start of Disc 3, where you can drain the water from her fountain and get it again. You can also return to this area later, and you can even get it as a drop in the final area. If you never acquire this pendant, you just randomly get an early bad ending and you don't get to see the end of the game. It's cruel if you don't know about it, so get the pendant. Also try getting the regular bad ending while losing to the final boss. It's weirdly better than the good ending. And that's about it in terms of Koudelka. The game will reportedly be moderately successful, and future projects would also suggest this. Koudelka would get a sequel manga following Koudelka a few months later, and while there was never a real Koudelka 2, we would see a follow-up to the universe and lore in the hit PS2 RPG series Shadow Hearts. It also made the normal bad ending canon. In the end, Koudelka deserves its cult following. Its mix of survival horror and RPG mechanics give a unique and fun experience. Its characters and their dynamics provide a slightly different but refreshing time. Its presentation is on the high end for the PS1. So if you're a fan of the PS1 generation, a fan of RPGs or the survival horror genre, or just want a well-executed game you can knock out in a weekend, go play Koudelka. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you liked it for some weird reason, consider leaving a like or comment. If you didn't like it, well, leave a comment anyways about what I did wrong. If you want to hear about more games I think are neat, or whatever random thing I end up making videos on, maybe also think about subscribing. Whatever you choose to do, I hope you have a nice day.